There is a specific moment in an investigation when the available evidence stops adding up in a way that is consistent with the working theory, and someone has to have the courage to say that out loud. That moment arrived in this case on April 30th, when two retired FBI profilers with decades of combined experience building behavioral assessments for the Bureau's most complex violent crime cases sat down and delivered an analysis that does not add to the existing theory. It dismantles it. The theory that has driven most of the public conversation around the disappearance of an 84-year-old grandmother from her Tucson home for nearly 3 months has been financial. Ransom demands pointed in that direction. Bitcoin addresses pointed in that direction. The behavior of the masked man, visible on the front porch security camera, deliberate, controlled, wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, pointed in that direction. Two experienced profilers, both of whom spent their careers inside the FBI studying how violent offenders think before anyone else could stop them, say everyone has been reading those signals wrong. The financial framework was never the real story, and the real story, once it is heard clearly, reframes every piece of evidence in this case from the beginning. The central claim these two profilers make is not ambiguous. The person who entered that home on the night of January 31st was not there for Nancy. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, privately living her life in Tucson, not a public figure in her own right, not someone who generated headlines or controversy, was not the reason that door was approached. She was the point of access. The target of the fixation, according to both profilers independently, was her daughter, a nationally recognized television personality who has been on screens across the country every weekday morning for years. Someone who has received fan mail, correspondence, social media messages, and contact attempts in volumes that most people do not experience, and that her professional security apparatus has been managing quietly throughout her career. It is that correspondence, the profilers argue, that holds the answer to this entire investigation. Not a Bitcoin wallet, not a tip from the public pool of 30,000 callers, a specific person in a specific set of documented communications whose behavior crossed a line at some identifiable point and whose fixation eventually found its way from the screen in their living room to the front door of a private home in Tucson. The behavioral profile these men describe is not constructed from instinct. It is built from the same methodology that produced the FBI's behavioral analysis framework, the empirical study of convicted violent offenders, conducted after their convictions through structured interviews that covered every crime they committed, using protocols that evolved from early anecdotal work into documented, repeatable research involving hundreds of questions per offender. That methodology allows experienced profilers to recognize patterns in behavior that precede a crime, to identify the kind of escalation curve that moves from passive observation to direct action, and to describe a type of individual, a profile, not a name whose internal logic is consistent with what the evidence at this scene shows. The escalation curve they describe for this case is specific. It begins with observation from a distance. It moves through attempts to establish connection or contact. It involves boundary testing that may have been noted somewhere and then dismissed as insignificant. And at some point along that curve, the passive became active, the distant became direct. The front door of a private home in Tucson became the place where that escalation ended its building phase and entered its operational one. What the profilers are asking investigators to do with this analysis is direct. Every piece of correspondence that the missing woman's daughter has received over at least the past 5 years needs to be reviewed against this behavioral profile. Not just the obviously threatening material, not just the communications that were flagged and filed as concerning at the time, all of it. Because a stalking-type fixation does not always announce itself in language that reads as dangerous when it first appears. It appears early in the progression as enthusiasm as the kind of devoted, effusive communication that a public figure receives constantly from audiences who feel a genuine personal connection to what they see on screen. The distinction between benign enthusiasm and the early stages of a fixation that will eventually become dangerous is often only visible in retrospect, when the pattern is laid out in sequence and the escalation becomes legible. Someone who sends consistent, emotionally loaded messages about a presenter's mother appearing on her show. Someone whose contact attempts register with unusual frequency. Someone whose tone shifts over time in ways that can now be read as the behavioral markers of a fixation that was always there. building towards something, even when no single message seemed alarming enough to act on. The blood evidence at the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home has been in public circulation since early in this investigation, but it was not until a retired FBI special agent and trained profiler examined the images frame by frame that the full forensic narrative contained in those photographs became clear. What he found, described in technical detail that deserves careful attention, changes the picture of what happened that night at that doorstep. There are two distinct types of blood present in the pattern. The first type, the larger droplets, fell in a manner that indicates they dropped from directly above without significant lateral momentum, meaning they landed on the threshold from a source that was positioned almost directly over the spot where they landed. The second type is more significant. The smaller droplets, described by the profiler as medium-velocity aspirated blood, tell a different story. They are not drops that fell from a wound under gravity. They are the result of blood being coughed or expelled through the respiratory tract, meaning whoever produced them had blood in their airway and forced it out through a cough. The rings visible in some of those droplets, rather than solid circles, confirm the mechanism. Blood that reaches the ground as a bubble, carrying air from the lungs that pushed it out, leaves that distinctive ring pattern on impact. Nancy Guthrie, confirmed by DNA analysis to be the source of this blood, was coughing blood from her airway onto her own front doorstep. The physical story that follows from this is not the one most people assumed. Nancy Guthrie, at 84, could barely walk without difficulty. But the profiler's reading of the blood pattern does not describe a woman who was simply overcome and carried out. It describes a woman who, at some point, and what happened on that threshold, was in a position where her face was within inches of the ground, close enough that blood she was coughing upward landed directly below her. She had been struck. She had gone down to her knees or lower, and the blood she coughed produced a pattern that is only consistent with her face being very close to the surface when it was expelled. The profiler's assessment is that this is likely where she fought back. The moment where, despite her age and her physical limitations, something in her resisted. He believes she was struck in the face, that the impact drove blood through her airway, that she went down to the ground at that point, and that it was at or after this moment that the person responsible picked her up and carried her away. She was ambulatory when she arrived at that door. She was not ambulatory when she left it. The profiler's assessment that this was almost certainly one person acting alone draws directly from this blood evidence. True offenders, he argues, would have maintained full physical control of an 84-year-old woman throughout the encounter without ever allowing her to reach the ground at all. The fact that she went down, that she fought, that she managed to produce the physical evidence of resistance, however briefly, is itself a behavioral signature that points to a single actor managing the encounter alone. A controlled two-person operation would not have produced this scene. The visible image of the masked man on the front porch security camera moving deliberately with a backpack and gloves is consistent with someone who arrived with a plan, but the blood pattern at the door reveals a moment where that plan met unexpected resistance and produced a consequence the offender had not fully accounted for. She was alive when he took her. The profiler is clear about that, and the plan, for whatever reason, did not proceed as constructed. The backpack visible on the masked man in the security footage has been the subject of significant public speculation since the images were released. A new development confirms that the backpack, which investigators have now examined, is not a viable lead. Whatever it contained, or wherever it was recovered, it does not open a new investigative avenue. That conclusion narrows the physical evidence picture further. The blood at the door, the hair in the laboratory, the behavior of the masked figure on camera, and the FBI's behavioral analysis framework are now the pillars on which the active investigation rests. A man was also arrested outside Nancy Guthrie's home, a development that was named in a significant police update, though the nature of that arrest and its connection to the primary investigation has not been publicly detailed. A former FBI agent who has followed this case closely has stated publicly that certain subtle signs now visible in the investigation's posture suggest that an arrest in the primary case may be very close. That assessment, from someone who understands how federal investigations signal their approach to resolution, is not casual. It is a professional reading of institutional behavior that warrants attention. The institutional dimension of this investigation has reached a point that requires direct examination rather than continued diplomatic framing. The elected sheriff of Pima County, the official most publicly responsible for the county side of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, has now been revealed to have a documented history of conduct that goes significantly further than the perjury allegations that were already public. The Pima County Board of Supervisors, through its vice chair and through formal investigative proceedings, has been examining whether the sheriff misrepresented his employment history when he was hired by the county, and the details of what that history actually contains are extraordinary. During his time at a previous law enforcement agency spanning the late 1970s and early 1980s, he accumulated a documented record of disciplinary action. Among the incidents that led to those actions was an incident in which he beat a handcuffed robbery suspect in the back of a squad car with a flashlight to the point where that individual required intensive care. The victim of that beating spent days in the hospital's ICU. The department was subsequently sued over the incident. The consequence for the officer at the time was not criminal prosecution, but eventually it contributed to a situation where he was forced to resign rather than face termination. He did not disclose this history when he was hired in Arizona. According to the vice chair of the Board of Supervisors, who has reviewed the documentation and spoken publicly about it, the only way the sheriff could have obtained peace officer certification in Arizona was by concealing that history, because no one with that record, fully disclosed, could have received that certification. He perpetrated a fraud, according to the board's vice chair, on the community for 4 decades. The relevance of this history to the investigation is not simply a matter of character. It is structural. The board's vice chair, a physician, not a law enforcement official, has explicitly stated that the sheriff's documented hostility toward the FBI, which dates to a 2015 period when he came close to being indicted on RICO-related charges before federal prosecutors ultimately did not proceed, has had a demonstrable effect on the working relationship between his department and federal investigators throughout this case. A law enforcement executive who holds a grudge against the agency that nearly indicted him does not collaborate naturally with that agency on a complex, high-stakes investigation. The friction that results from that compromised relationship has consequences for information flow, for joint decision-making on investigative priorities, and for the speed at which evidence is processed and shared between agencies. The board's vice chair was asked directly whether that fractured relationship may have jeopardized elements of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. The answer was not reassuring, very possible. Not probably not unlikely, very possible. The Ring doorbell camera controversy adds another dimension to the surveillance failures visible in this case. The CEO of Ring, the company that produces widely used residential security camera systems, faced significant public backlash after suggesting publicly that more widespread camera adoption in the neighborhood around Nancy Guthrie's home might have made it possible to track the suspect more effectively. The backlash was swift and pointed. Critics argued that using a missing elderly woman's disappearance to promote commercial surveillance technology crosses an ethical line that a corporate executive should understand without having to be told. The controversy is worth noting not for the marketing angle, which is its own problem, but for what it confirms about the evidentiary landscape. The existing camera coverage around the home was limited enough that the masked man on the front porch security camera represents one of the most significant visual leads in the entire case. And even that image is described as grainy. An investigation into the disappearance of an elderly woman in a residential neighborhood in a major American city, nearly 3 months in, is relying in part on a single blurry security camera image as its primary visual evidence. That is a reflection of both the coverage gaps in the neighborhood and the deliberateness with which the person responsible appears to have navigated them. The father of Elizabeth Smart, a young woman who was kidnapped from her bedroom in 2002 and recovered alive after 9 months, has offered perspective on this case that carries a particular weight. He knows what a family experiences in the months after a disappearance, when the media attention begins to thin, when the public moves on to other news cycles, and when the family is left continuing to advocate for their missing person in a world that is increasingly looking elsewhere. His message to the public is specific and practical. Keep looking, keep sending information. Recognize that the answer may be in a memory or an observation that someone has not yet connected to this case. His message to the family, from someone who has lived through exactly what they are living, is that the continuation of normal life is not a betrayal. It is what survivors do. It is what families do when the alternative is simply ceasing to function. And his caution about conspiracy theories directed at the public is worth hearing plainly. The family has been cleared by investigators, and every moment the public spends constructing theories about people who have been eliminated from the investigation is a moment not spent on the person who actually matters. The financial trail in this case has been examined from multiple directions, and every direction has reached the same wall. The Bitcoin address associated with the ransom demands received no deposit despite the family's stated willingness to pay. Investigators and journalists who tracked the email account used to send the ransom communications were unable to identify the account's owner. The cryptocurrency address itself, while publicly visible in terms of whether funds enter it, is structured in a way that makes identifying the recipient of any funds effectively impossible without direct cooperation from the person who controls it. This is not a technical limitation that can be overcome with effort. It is a feature of anonymous digital currency infrastructure that was almost certainly understood by whoever set up the account. The profilers who assessed the ransom notes point to this setup as evidence of planning, not impulsive planning, not the kind of thing someone constructs the night before a crime, but deliberate preparation for the aftermath of something that had been considered in advance. You do not set up an anonymous Bitcoin account and a route for untraceable communication as a last-minute operational decision. You prepare those tools because you are thinking about what happens after the act, not just during it. That level of preparation is entirely consistent with the behavioral profile these two profilers have described, a person whose escalation was sustained, deliberate, and carefully constructed over a long period before January 31st. If you have been following this case and you have found this analysis useful, this is the point where your engagement matters. A national television special on this case is scheduled to air on a major network in the coming days, which means a second significant wave of public attention is about to reach this story. Second waves create pressure on the people who know something, on the person responsible, and on the institutional structures managing the investigation. That pressure has a documented history in missing persons cases of producing the one mistake, the one conversation, the one behavioral slip that connects a detail investigators already have to a detail they have been missing. If you know something, if you have seen something, if you heard someone say something about this case that did not sit right, if you remember a person whose behavior shifted around the time of January 31st, the tip line exists for exactly that reason. A reward exceeding $1.20 million remains unclaimed. That money is available for information leading to the missing woman's whereabouts. Not a conviction, not an arrest, information. Savannah Guthrie, who has said publicly in her own words that it is too much to bear to think she brought this to her mother's doorstep, expressed the motive of this crime before any profiler stated it on the record. She understood it instinctively because she understood what no one on the outside could fully see, that someone had been watching her world from a distance for long enough to know how to find the point of entry into the part of that world she did not share on camera. Her mother. Her private life, the person who was most reachable and least protected. The two profilers who have now made that same assessment professionally are not adding drama to a story that already has too much of it. They are building from documented behavioral science and the specific evidence this case has produced, the most coherent account of what happened that anyone has offered in 3 months. It is not a financial story. It never was. It is a story about obsession, escalation, and a door in Tucson that someone had been planning to reach for far longer than a single night. Savannah disappeared mid-broadcast during a Today Show episode, prompting immediate public concern that she had received a significant update on her mother's case. Her Today Show return date, revealed in an emotional interview, came alongside a statement that she said what she needed to say, and is learning to carry both things at once, the professional life and the open wound of not knowing. Her colleague, Hoda Kotb, herself working through a professional transition and reportedly eager to return to the broadcast, has maintained visible solidarity throughout this period. The Today Show team, including Al Roker and others who have spoken publicly about their support for their colleague, has formed the kind of collective human infrastructure around her that becomes essential when formal systems are performing as inconsistently as the official investigation is performed. What the investigation needs now, what it has needed for 3 months, is a breakthrough that comes from the behavioral thread, not the financial one. A name extracted from a pattern of correspondence. A person identified from a profile that 2 experienced former federal agents have now laid out in documented, on-record terms. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for nearly 3 months. The case is active, the reward is unclaimed, and the answer, according to the people most qualified to know where to look, is not in a tip pool of 30,000 callers. It is in a much smaller circle, and someone inside that circle already holds a piece of it.